We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Coming up this week.
The assassination attempt on Robert Fico has left Europe bemused. Shouldn't it have left Europe stunned? In an age where condemnation of violent rhetoric has never been fiercer, it seems condemnation of actual violence has seldom been milder. As we move into a more fractious and populist age, what are the implications of the media's seemingly divergent views on who it is and who it is not acceptable to assassinate?
The G7 are meeting in Italy, just after Joe Biden dropped his massive package of trade tariffs onto China. So in the spirit of never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake, are the Europeans going to clap as he blows America's head off? Nope. It turns out they're going to join him. We'll be reporting from the G7 Suicide Pact.
New figures say that China has dialed down its US government bond holdings by $53 billion in the first quarter of this year. Last week, we gave you the full doomsday 2025 scenario for when the Yuan stops backstopping America. Today, we're giving you the real-world here and now version. The long, slow slide goes on.
But first,
when liberals kill.
Listeners will be aware that last week the Slovakian Prime Minister, Robert Fico, was shot 4 times by a would-be assassin. He was rushed to hospital. His condition was at first life-threatening, and we're led to believe at the time of recording he's still not out of the woods, although his condition has stabilized. What was perhaps as shocking as the assassination attempt itself has been the response of the mainstream European media. Almost as soon as news of the assassination broke, it was almost as though everybody had got the same memo in the media. You had Sky News in the UK and the Financial Times in the UK all running very similar lines, which was basically this, that Robert Fico was a hugely divisive character, a hugely divisive politician, and this divisiveness would inevitably beget violence, and it was that which was responsible for the assassination attempt. Now, I found this absolutely astonishing. I thought, first of all, it was a very strange kind of argument from a logical point. Ignoring the morality of essentially saying he was asking for it. You know, he was wearing a short skirt, ignoring the morality of that for a second. They seem to be arguing that, if the pro-European, pro-Atlanticist party had won 3 or 4 more percentage points, they would have been unifying in some way. If you get elected in a close election, then you're divisive. If we get elected, we're unifying. Somehow, in one sense, the opposition disappears, and in the other sense, the opposition is wronged and outraged, and thereffer understandably prone to violence. So I thought it was a hugely illogical argument, but more than that, I was just shocked. A lot of the all, I should say, European leaders expressed their dismay and offered condolences at the event, but it wasn't the kind of highly emotive, full-throated display of horror and disgust and outrage that such a thing had happened. It was very perfunctory. It was very kind of bog standard. It was like, oh yes, we offer our condolences. It's really terrible. Goodbye. But certainly the media, in Britain at least, I'm not sure what it was like in Europe, but in Britain and Politico.eu, which is a German organization, I believe, all went with this line that Fico was a divisive politician, and therefore it's understandable that violence came. I'm just shocked by the whole thing, and I do not think that it bodes well for Europe. Philip Pilkington, you've got some thoughts on this.
What can you really say about the assassination attempt? It appears to be some sort of a liberal pro-Ukraine war guy, I guess. Obviously, Fico's main claim to fame, in a sense, is his opposition to the Ukraine war. on some of the domestic policies at home relating to, I don't know, what it depends on what you read, media crackdowns, foreign influence, whatever. I mean, this usual stuff that you see in Central Europe. But it was the media reaction that really stood out to me. It's probably worth pointing out that we don't have many assassination attempts against leaders in Europe. Assassinations of leaders, I wouldn't say often, but I'd say more often probably happen in America, probably due to access to guns, higher rate of violence, but also because of the kind of higher pitch of the political discussion there, I suppose you could say. People shout at each other a lot, call each other names over there. And that's starting to take off in Europe. But I'm just looking at the list of attempted assassinations on leaders. And the last one that we had is in 2003, Anna Lindh, Swedish foreign minister, leading Social Democrat. The last assassination attempt, whose name you might recognize, is Jacques Chirac in 2002. Somebody shot at him on Bastille Day. So in the 2000s, you have Pim Fortuyn, who was killed, but he wasn't actually incumbent. He was running. Jacques Chirac, Zoran Djindjic, Serbian prime minister, who was assassinated, and Anna Lindh, the Swedish foreign minister. So that's only four. It's in a fairly similar period of time, actually. It's after 2002 to 2003. So it's in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and in the run-up to the Iraq War. A lot of tensions around political Islam and that kind of thing then. So maybe that's where it broke out. But I guess the difference is that you'd hope that if there's political violence in Europe, that there'd be a very, very strong and uncompromising condemnation of it, no matter who it was aimed at. And I say that not for moralistic reasons, although I think there is a moralistic case for taking that position, but for pragmatic reasons. Political violence tends to be, how would you put it, replicative. If people think that it's okay, if they think that they're going to get maybe not praise for it, but not like strong condemnation and basically to be treated like lowlives, they're more inclined to do it. So you got to be really careful. It's a little bit like those movies that convince teenagers to kill themselves or whatever. Like, you want to be careful with that stuff because it's a pretty obvious sociological phenomenon. And so you think that the press would say, okay, we don't like Robert Fico. We don't really like some of the stuff he's doing domestically in Slovakia, although who's an expert in the Western media on Slovakian national politics? I find even the notion that people know what's going on there pretty funny. We don't like his war position. Okay, maybe he's a little bit bellicose, whatever. But, you strongly condemn it. You just go, no, there's limits here because it could spiral. And we could see increased political violence in Europe. And that's really the kind of thing that it could do, well, we can talk about in a minute the kind of things that can spiral off into, but just generally speaking, it can cause absolute chaos. So I think the type of people who open the Pandora's box in that regard are extremely unwise. They also seem not really to understand how things work, which is surprising in and of itself. But I suppose a couple of examples of headlines that I saw here. So I think it's worth. So just prior to the assassination attempt, the day before, I think, Politico.eu ran a headline saying Slovakia chided for chilling effect of changes to NGO public media laws. And I think I'm right in saying the assassin is basically attributing a lot of these kind of Ukraine war, he's cracking down internally and so on. So now there's nothing hot really about that headline. It's pretty staid in a sense, but it's making these fairly extreme accusations, I'd say. It reminds me kind of the kind of rhetoric about Donald Trump or something like that. It was really the reaction after the attempted shooting or the attempted killing. The shooting took place. The killing did not so far. That was really worrying because people can get ahead of themselves and say some nasty things, and then a bad event happens and people, pump the brakes and they say, okay, maybe it's time to calm down on this stuff. But I mean, even the Financial Times, the headline the next day was how Slovakia's toxic politics left PM fighting for his life. I mean, sorry, you don't say that. You don't say that at all. If an assassination attempt happens in Europe and you think it's not just your moral duty, but you're practically a practical person and you're a normal person and you're like, I don't want political violence in Europe. You don't say that. And in fact, I see, looking at the roster of journalists who wrote about it, one of them we might remember from a certain fake story against the Hungarian government a while ago. Maybe not fake, but it had to be retracted. The claim was, I think, that the European Commission was going to engage in harsh some sort of financial sanctions or crush the economy of Hungary or something. Anyway, it turned out to be complete rubbish. The Commission denied it. It's completely embarrassing. So it's Central European. It feels like they apply different standards to it. And then if you go to kind of like The Guardian, that feels to me where the real kind of venom is these days. The first one is, who is Robert Fico, the pro-Russian leader poised to head Slovakia's coalition government? Really? You want to portray the assassination attempt as against a pro-Russian leader? We don't have to go into whether Robert Fico is pro-Russian or not. It's meaningless in a sense. But the point is that with headlines like that, you're pulling the war in Ukraine into Europe, into the European Union. That's really, really dangerous stuff. So the last thing I'd just say is this could go in many directions now. These seem like deeply immature people, I would say. I think that would be the way I describe the type of journalism that we say now. It's run by immature people. And actually, if you know journalists these days, not all, there's some good journalists, but a lot of kind of theater kids, immature people who probably don't know anything about violence or anything like that. They very secluded kind of people seem to be going into the field. And that's what comes out in these headlines. But one of the things that's come out now 2 days ago is somebody from the Slovakian government is saying that the prime minister's attacker may not have been a lone wolf and that there might have been other people involved. Now, look, it's speculation. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But the point is not really whether that's true or not, but that it's sowing these seeds of paranoia and distrust. And those seeds of paranoia and distrust, at the same time as there's a major war going across the border, and at the same time as these very immature kind of theater kid journalists are pulling in headlines saying like, well, he's pro-Russian. It feels like you might be trying to spread the violence and the conflict out from where it's contained to at the moment. So overall, it's very worrying. I think it's worth keeping an eye on. I mean, we all will keep an eye on it because we'll be forced to. But I think our media class have really, really, really sunk in my estimation. Now, I've never been a particular fan of the media personally, but this is one of the lowest and least civilized things I've seen in journalism that I can remember.
Yeah, I agree with you on all counts. And as I said at the beginning, ignoring the morality of this, which I think you've outlined extremely well. What's very concerning is what the tone and what the decision to editorialize an attempted assassination on a head of government in Europe will have for the future of politics and social cohesion in Europe. Because it very much seems to me that what is essentially being said here is that if you go against the general consensus of the European political class, the established consensus of the last kind of, well, certainly the last 25, 30 years, but perhaps the last 40 years in Western Europe at least, if you go against that consensus, and it's worth reminding ourselves that, Robert Fico had gone against that consensus. He seemed to be a little bit in some ways like Viktor Orban in terms of his political program. He wanted to achieve peace in Ukraine rather than continuing to send weapons and aiming to win a kind of total victory over the Russian Federation. And for that, he was called pro-Russian. He seemed to have more of a conservative bent on social matters and be more interested in, or less interested in getting involved in the kind of the transatlantic great power struggle between the United States and China, something which, as we spoke about before, a lot of European politicians want to kind of hitch themselves to the US wagon on that. He seemed to be, against that and more interested in what was in Slovakia's narrow interests and Europe's broader interests. And for that, he seems to have been, it feels, I might be wrong here, Philip, but it feels to me that through the media, the kind of the establishment in Europe, the kind of the elite political class in Europe is basically saying, well, anything goes. If you go against us, then you can't expect our sympathy. I mean, at present, it seems to me that at present, it looks very much like this was undertaken by a lunatic. But, you have people like Guy Verhofstadt, or Guy Verhofstadt, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but he linked to on Twitter 2 days ago, he linked to a politicoeu.eu article with the headline, "Roots of Robert Fico's shooting lie in Slovakia's bitter divides." Okay, so exactly what you were saying, essentially saying, his shooting is excusable because he was somehow divisive. He was kind of against the Western world's liberal globalist consensus. And Verhofstadt's comment on his tweet was, "The road to violence starts with violent rhetoric. Many EU countries, parties and politicians who should know better are advancing on the same path. Time for all Democrats to reconsider." I mean, it almost sounds that as though Guy Verhofstadt, who's an MEP and president of the European Movement International, is and a very prominent European parliamentarian, is saying that, well, this is exactly what's going to happen if people don't reconsider their populist ideals. And I think, digging your heels in this way and implying or suggesting or hinting or wink, wink, nudge, nudging that this is exactly the sort of thing that might happen if people dare to go against the consensus. I think it bodes really ill for the future of social cohesion and political stability in Europe. I think it's very dangerous indeed, and I found the whole thing quite dismaying.
Well, the first thing I'd just say quickly is I'm surprised at these people, I guess, from a number of perspectives. I've already said that I find the journalism very immature and kind of like somebody who's never been in a fight before or something, not really. Then going and picking a fight, that's how it feels, really immature. The political leaders especially, I mean, most of them were okay. Let's give credit where credit is due. All the heads of state, including Zelensky in Ukraine, came out and did the usual. This is absolutely unacceptable. We hope Robert Fico will be okay. It was this like brigand almost of like really gross swamp creatures that came out mainly in the media and in these other places, like you said, Guy Verhofstadt and these guys. I mean, the other thing I'd just say about them really quickly is they're not going to go down well in history. This is a really bad look. Like, you may get a pat on the back from the hardcore pro-Ukraine war people now, but like, yeah, loads of people got a pat on the back in 2003, 2004 for jumping on board that train. Look where they are now. I'm not saying it's exactly the same thing, but when historians or anyone goes back to write about this and they dig up quotes like that, I mean, they'll look at it in horror, and that'll probably go down as your quote now. If you're somebody like Guy Verhofstadt, like, that's yours now. That's who you are. So I don't even get the kind of self-conception that goes into this. The very last thing I'd say is a lot of the people who piled on here will probably think of themselves as proud liberals. I mean, we don't want to, there's no point in calling it quote unquote hypocrisy. It's done to death or whatever. But I think this goes slightly deeper than that. Like, I'm not a liberal. I think everybody knows that. But the selling point of liberalism is that you're kind of a tolerant, level-headed, nice dude. I mean, that's kind of the baseline of it. Obviously, there's an ideology. You can have John Rawls, you can have John Locke, all this. But really at a base level, most people's self-identification as a liberal, if they say that in an opinion poll or something, that's how they think. They think I'm a forward-thinking, good person who subscribes to relatively progressive ideas. I believe in progress. I believe in going forward. And I believe in kind of like sorting things out through dialogue and stuff like that. That's not the liberals we see today. The liberals today are like steam coming out of their ears, like red-faced, engaged in violent rhetoric, doing this kind of thing like toxic politics will get you put in this position, like taking, I don't want to go too far on it, but like some of the more gross accounts on Twitter, like taking pleasure in the fact that somebody's been hurt, this kind of thing. Like, it feels to me that if that's where liberal ideology is going, then I think liberal ideology is probably going to cease to exist, because you've stripped liberal ideology then of everything that's made it attractive and just made it this kind of like zealous, aggressive, in your face. I'm not even clear why you're in my face. You just want to be in my face and you want to shout at me and you want to be in power. So once you strip away all that, maybe all you see is like the iron fist and the velvet glove. That's not attractive in general, but that's especially unattractive for people who would generally self-identify as liberalism. So on both counts, I'd say this is extremely self-destructive for the people who are engaged in this sort of immature nonsense.
Yelling into the void. Listeners might be aware, being the erudite and attentive individuals that they are, that the finance ministers of the G7 organization are meeting in Italy this week. And in advance of that meeting, Janet Yellen, the secretary to the US Treasury, which is the American equivalent of finance minister, or what we would call Chancellor of the Exchequer, gave a speech in Germany in which she called or hinted or suggested or cajoled Europe to join the US in sanctioning China and its so-called excessive production. She said, and I quote, "China's industrial policy may seem remote as we sit here in this room, but if we do not respond strategically and in a united way, the viability of businesses in both our countries and around the world could be at risk." She probably said it slightly less interestingly than that, but that was the exact quote. The New York Times article, which reported on her speech, it's always worth reading the New York Times because they do drop hints at what the official line in Washington is, said, and again I'm quoting, but this is not from Yellen, it's from the New York Times piece, "China's excessive production of green energy technology has become a pressing transatlantic concern in recent months." Now you'll note there, China's excessive production. They're reporting Ms. Yellen's views that China has a problem with excessive production as fact, as if it's China's excessive production. But let's get beyond that. Essentially, at present, everyone will be aware, and certainly those people who listened to our voice essays last week will be aware that the United States has put tariffs, hefty, high tariffs, on a range of Chinese products and manufactured goods, and most prominently on electric vehicles, on battery technology, and on solar panels. Now, concurrently, the European Commission is investigating whether China is putting enough in terms of state subsidies into those industries as to justify perhaps the Europeans engaging in tariffs or anti-dumping tariffs or whatever they might want to call it themselves. And I think, Janet Yellen is trying to kind of cajole them to get on board with this, because I think the last thing that the US would want is for them to be out on their own on this matter. From my perspective, two things are quite surprising here. First of all, both the US and the EU have shown us exactly what they think on environmental matters. They sanctioned Russian gas, which was, not just important in terms of cheap energy, but it was actually of much greater importance to Europe's so-called energy transition, its transition to green energy, than is widely known. Russian gas emits less, has less greenhouse and kind of air quality poor emissions than things like coal and fuel oil. But it was also going to be a crucial feedstock to kickstart the hydrogen industry. Now the US has started sanctioning cheap green energy technology from China, which is at the very least at the margin going to slow the energy transition as well. So I think both sides have shown us exactly where their priorities lie on the environment. But I think more importantly than that, you and I and me especially have spoken extensively about this battle between the Atlanticists and the autonomists. Is Europe going to hitch itself to the US wagon and basically get tied in with the US's crusade to control and contain the rise of China? Or is it going to follow what's in its own interests? Well, this is a test, isn't it, Philip Pilkington? Is the EU just going to get blindly on board with US tariffs? Or is it going to follow its own interests? Now, it might be in Europe's interest to try and negotiate something with the Chinese, to try to say, look, you can't kill us on this. For instance, Hungary has got a BYD, the most prominent maker of Chinese electric vehicles is a company called BYD, and Hungary is going to build and open a plant to manufacture BYD EVs in Hungary. Macron has spoken about potentially doing the same thing. Now, Europe might want to negotiate those sorts of deals because, you have to remember that a lot of the great German economic miracle, one pillar of that was getting cheap energy from Russia. The other pillar was basically hanging on to the coattails of China's breakneck economic growth by pumping a whole bunch of high value added goods, the sort of high value added manufactured products that Germany makes, like trains, like these kind of huge machines that Siemens make, like BMWs and Mercedes, for example. And it made hay with that. Now, I would have thought that Germany doesn't want to cut itself off from that altogether. So this is a test, Philip. Is Europe going to follow the US blindly on this? Or are they going to try to chart their own course and perhaps try to negotiate something with China? It's a big question.
Well, the first thing to say is there may be a bit of do what we say, not what we do going on here, because I read a report the other day, quietly, that BYD are also building a factory in Mexico with the backing of a famous billionaire from, I can't remember which country, Warren Buffett. Somebody might know his nationality. If they can remind me in the comments, that'll be great. So Warren Buffett's backing a BYD factory, as I understand it, in Mexico, and Mexico falls under NAFTA trade rules. So apparently, as long as that goes through, it's pretty much the same operation as we're talking about in Hungary. So probably worth noting and interesting that didn't get widespread political coverage. Second thing to say is the car manufacturers themselves in Europe have been very, very against this. So just two quotes that came up for me here. This is from Oliver Zips, CEO of BMW. "You could shoot yourself in the foot pretty quickly." He said, "We don't believe our industry needs protection. It's easy to jeopardize the advantage that you have operating globally by introducing tariffs on imports." And here he's alluding to the fact that it can result in a trade war. CEO of Volkswagen, Thomas Schaefer, says pretty much the same thing. There's always some sort of retaliation, he says. So the car manufacturers are totally against this. And the reason for it is simple enough. Unlike America, frankly, the European car industry is actually globally competitive. If you've ever been abroad, if you've gone anywhere, you'll see European cars. You don't see as many American cars. There's reasons for that. American cars aren't as competitive on the global market as European cars because there's a lot more protection in the United States. And that's fine for the US because they have this big market for their cars. But Europe, they have a pretty big market too, but one of the things that they've decided to do is keep their cars internationally competitive. Now, in order to keep them internationally competitive, you need two things. First of all, you need no tariffs on your cars. And second of all, you need competition to keep you sharp. If you don't have the competition to keep you sharp, you'll get lazy. This just always happens. It's the nature of things. And so I think the BMW and the Volkswagen guys would say, look, even if these Chinese EVs come in and absolutely smoke us for even maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years, they're totally ruining our business. We'll come back. We're BMW, we're Volkswagen, we're all companies. We'll figure out a way to make a cost competitive vehicle with those Chinese products. That's probably what they're thinking. Whereas they're also thinking, if they put the tariffs in place, fine, we'll be forcing EU consumers to buy German and European EVs. That's fine. They'll have to buy them. But at the same time, those will become really crappy because there won't be any competition. There won't be anything to rub off against. And they'll be overpriced. And so what'll end up happening there is, you get those 3 years of more sales to Europe, but then your global market just dissipates because the Chinese cars just flood them, and you're being kept away from the competitive forces that are at work on you. And of course, that raises the question of what on earth is Janet Yellen thinking? Janet Yellen is supposed to be an economist. This stuff that I'm talking about, competition, is like some of the most basic stuff you'll learn in an economics undergraduate class. This is the kind of thing you probably don't even need to do in economics undergraduate class. You just have to be an avid reader of The Economist magazine and you'll probably get it. This is like pop economics 101. It's not even economics 101. So why is Janet Yellen saying this? Does she have a coherent strategy? Because the other thing I'd raise is that ultimately for Janet Yellen, why does it matter about tariffs on Chinese cars in Europe? Because if the Americans have decided for themselves that they want to make their car market even less competitive, it's already pretty uncompetitive, but they want to make it even less competitive, they can do that. They're a sovereign nation. They've got a big market. They've tried and tested protectionist models on their cars before. I mean, they work in their own way. They don't make globally competitive cars, but they have their domestic market. That's fine. They can raise that and keep doing it. Now, the cars will fall further and further behind the rest of the world, but that's their choice. There is no reason that they need Europe to do it too. If America imposes those tariffs, it has X impact on the American car market. If Europe does it on their cars, it doesn't have any impact on the American car market, you see? So it's actually not clear what this is. Why do America care if the EU are raising tariffs? And the only thing you can come away from it with is that this is some security thing. This is some idea they've got in their head. I think it's floating around the National Security Council at the moment. I think it's associated with Jake Tapper. That's what I hear. That they've got this idea into their head that they can do this like multi-pronged trade war and it's going to somehow like make the West win or something. And it's just so bizarre to me because the first plank of these arguments were like sanctions. Yeah. So you're going to do sanctions on chips. And you're going to do sanctions on chips, and the chips aren't going to go to China, and China's going to fall behind in X, Y, and Z. We've done loads of stuff on chips, and we've been proved pretty much right on it. It just spurred the Chinese to compete. Remember that word competition that you read about in The Economist magazine? And we're back to pop economics 101 again. So that didn't work. But okay, I can see a rationale to it. We have the technology. We restrict the technology. You fall behind. And the assumption there is you're too dumb to figure out the technology yourself. Bad assumption on the Chinese, but okay, I can see the argument. What's the argument here? That Europe and America pull up separate tariff drawbridges. Remember, they're not entering into a free trade in cars with each other. No way. The Americans aren't saying that because the American car industry will get absolutely smoked if they did that, and they know that. So they're pulling up separate tariff drawbridges on each region. And then what does it do? You've just created two Robinson Crusoe islands while the Chinese just absolutely dominate the rest of the world in EV manufacturing. Whereas if we go with what the CEO, the guys who actually run the companies say, they're like, no, just keep them down. We'll take the hit for a while, and then we'll get globally competitive. Now, if you're America and you're concerned about global influence of your allies and all that, wouldn't you prefer to see Volkswagen and BMW EVs in Latin America and Africa and East Asia than not see them? You'd think so, but apparently Janet Yellen doesn't understand pop economics 101. I don't know how to actually describe. I don't know anymore how to rationalize this. It's gone now beyond the point where it's like, okay, you guys are making a bet on those chip sanctions. You're wrong. Okay, testable hypothesis. Let's see. Well, they were wrong. Fine. This isn't even testable hypothesis. There doesn't seem to be a coherent argument here, and I'm increasingly getting the sense that after the failure of the chip sanctions and all this kind of re-export market stuff that's going around Mexico and ASEAN and BYD building their factory here and there to get through the barriers and stuff, these guys who've concocted this big house of cards idea that they're going to be able to do this slightly ill-defined ultra trade war to win back the world, everything just isn't working. And they're reaching for increasingly less rational ideas. And now we're descending into the kind of vibes-based part of the policy playbook, I suppose you'd say.
What really concerns me about this is that I kind of agree with you that it doesn't really make a lot of sense from an economics point of view. I think there's always been a certain protectionist bent within Europe, especially from the French. And in a range of areas, including cars to a certain degree, but especially on agricultural In the agricultural sector, there is pretty hefty protectionism within the European Union. I think, though, that the reason that the Americans are doing this is simply this. They know that anything that they would do would be far more effective if the European Union was involved as well. The European Union, for all its faults, and America, for all its faults, are still massive economies, right? The EU as a whole would be the third largest economy in the world. The EU and the US together are a huge chunk of global GDP and almost the entirety of wealthy people in the world. If you want to sell cars into an affluent marketplace, but you can't get to the European Union or the US, then you don't really have many options in terms of affluent marketplace. You've got to wait for the places to come up. And I think America knows this. So what they would like is for the European Union to say, yeah, we'll follow you and we'll help you. But this is just asking the European Union to help America with its foreign policy aims, like for good or bad. It wants to punish the Chinese. It wants to kind of curtail China's rise. Well, okay, but what's in it for us? And a couple of things that I should mention, just to add to some of the things that you were saying about European car manufacturers. European car manufacturers, until very recently, have been extremely competitive and extremely successful in China, especially brands like Volkswagen, for example. And Volkswagen last year bought a 5% stake in a Chinese car manufacturer for $700 million. And the idea was to produce electric vehicles together so that Volkswagen could regain its kind of position as one of the kings of the Chinese car market, but also so that it could learn from China's battery and EV technology and manufacturing process. Because there's a recognition clearly within Volkswagen that this isn't all about just subsidies, as is often claimed in the press. It's because China has an extremely competitive car marketplace. It's because, yes, there is a lot of state encouragement and state help of various types in China to help these companies, but also because it's extremely competitive and the Chinese are great at manufacturing. And they've also thought a lot about building an entire ecosystem that can benefit electric vehicles. They have recognized that the European Union and the United States, two of the, outside China, the two biggest car marketplaces in the world, and certainly the two wealthiest, have wanted for a long time to switch to electric vehicles. The European Union as a whole and individual European Union nations have passed laws setting deadlines beyond which, some of which are as close as 2030, most of which are 2035 or 2040, but beyond which no internal combustion engine car can be made. Certainly the Democratic Party and probably a plurality of the kind of, the US donor class and media class would like something similar in the US. The Chinese recognized that years ago and said, okay, electric vehicles are the future. Let's see if we can, what kind of policy can we put together to give us an advantage in that? And it wasn't just about shoveling money towards car manufacturers. They built an entire ecosystem, everything from internal market subsidies to build an internal market to buy electric vehicles. I think I'm right in saying that now 30% of all electric vehicles in China, all vehicles in China are EVs, or all the new ones bought are EVs. So they created a big internal market. They rolled out loads of infrastructure in terms of charging ports, in terms of places where you can roll your car in and have your battery swapped out very quickly. They built a very competitive company market. It's not just this like three essential monopolists as you've got with General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford in the US. There are scores of companies, and some of them have gone bankrupt because they failed. Some of them have, the cream has risen to the top essentially, and they built this ecosystem. And now Volkswagen clearly recognized, well, look, why don't we go there and get some kind of know-how transfer that we can transfer back? That's That's how things traditionally worked. The Chinese did it. I mean, one way or another, but certainly above board, they had companies set up in China so that they could start to understand the manufacturing process in certain areas. This is a well accepted way that things go. And now Volkswagen are doing it in the reverse sense. But there was one, very ominous point in the New York Times article. I saved it till last. It's just a very short paragraph. It says, in the meantime, Chinese electric vehicle makers, including BYD and Great Wall Motor, are setting up factories in Hungary to build cars that would be viewed as European-made products. Now, this is the key part, which could raise trade issues eventually with the United States. Like, what they're hinting at here is not only are you going to block the import of Chinese cars, but we actually want you to block any kind of involvement with Chinese companies in these key areas. This is a huge ask, and I think if Europe crumble on this, it's kind of all over for Europe. It just becomes a pretty big satrap of the United States, and that might be a good thing. I mean, there are plenty of European politicians who believe that's the way it should be, but certainly if the US is going to start kicking up a fuss about BYD building plants in Hungary, or maybe a Chinese tech company like Huawei building a plant in Europe, or a Chinese chip manufacturer in the future building a plant in Europe, or battery makers building a plant in Europe. If the Americans are going to block that sort of thing, or kick up a fuss, then it's such a huge ask. It's going to lead, I would have thought, to a kind of almost a break between Europe and the US, or it's going to lead to Europe once and for all just becoming a kind of a satrap of Washington.
Dollarmageddon. Yeah, so big headline this week, headline of a chart in my chart digging that I do for my Twitter account in Bloomberg that showed China's selling of Treasury and US agency debt rises to record. So China are really dumping the treasuries now, the US treasuries. And we'll get onto it later, but they seem to be recycling this money back into gold. So the whole thing has a bit of a strong de-dollarization vibe to it, shall we say. One of our favorite topics, de-dollarization on multipolarity. It seems to be accelerating now. And because it's accelerating, it's making its way into the mainstream, and places like Bloomberg are highlighting this. Not as much as I thought. I didn't see any reporting on this, for example, in the Financial Times. So there's still nervousness about talking about these dynamics. But the chart says what it says. It's a record dumping of US Treasury bonds. And the chart goes all the way back to 2000. And prior to 2000, that was before China had even accumulated the things. So this is forever. So I did a bit of a thread on Twitter that went viral, pretty viral. I was surprised by it. Just explaining what this means, because basically I posted the chart and I'd said to people, like, this could end up creating some sort of fiscal crisis in the US. And it's a funny old response I got, actually. I mean, what I got was the MMT response. We can go into in a moment what that is. And the MMT response is fine. It's actually understandable. I'm going to describe why it's incorrect in this regard. But I think the MMT argument is at least respectable in terms of a country can run as much debt as it wants, and it's not constrained in doing so if it prints its own currency. But what's really funny is that the people who went after me before I posted the thread, the people who went after me with the MMT argument of like the US can't go broke and all this, these are like conservative China hawks. And like, I bet if I'd scroll through their feed, they'd be retweeting stuff about Biden bankrupting the country or whatever. So it's funny how people's minds can bend when they need to. But anyway, so to get on it seriously, I mean, that is the counter argument to this. The MMT argument, for people who don't know, that's modern monetary theory. The MMT argument that basically if you issue your own currency, you can't go broke, right? So it doesn't really matter who's buying or selling your debt, because you can just issue the currency. And in effect, what that means is the central bank can buy up that debt. And there's nuances to that the central bank will actually automatically buy up the debt due to interest rate, the way they set interest rates. But it doesn't really matter. The point is that the central bank can monetize debt and does monetize debt on a routine basis. I disagree with none of this. It is an accurate description of most fiat money systems. The problem is that we're not saying that just anybody, Joe Soap, is offloading his treasury. Because if Joe Soap lives in the United States and he offloads his treasury, what the MMT people says is pretty much true. It'll put pressure on interest rates and it'll be absorbed by the Federal Reserve if needs be. But Joe Soap is not China. It's very, very different when you have an external, another country, or people in another country holding your debt. And the reason it matters so much is because of what's called the balance of payments in economics. And this is what I was describing in the thread. The balance of payments is on the one side, it's the current account. That's basically, think of it in terms of the trade account, trade surplus, trade deficit. And on the other side is the financial account, sometimes called capital account, but that's confused. There's actually three. Financial account, current account. And basically the short version of this is if you run a trade deficit on your current account, it has to be matched with a financial account surplus. Now that financial account surplus, that means more money coming in than going out, can be either foreign direct investment, that's FDI. People have probably heard of that loads of times before. That's a foreign country going in and building a factory in your country. But FDI doesn't really work most of the time to plug big trade deficits. The other one is portfolio investment, bonds, equities. That's where the real stuff happens with these big trade deficits. And that's especially where stuff happens in the United States. And that's what we mean. We've said it a million times on the show, that the US issues paper and gets goods and services in return. It issues dollar paper, and that goes out into the world and it buys goods and services. And those dollars are then sent back into the financial account on the balance of payments, and they buy into portfolio investment, bonds and equities. And that's what keeps the whole thing going. That's what allows the United States to run perpetual trade deficits.